Friday, August 13th, 1971. The phone lines out of Washington ran hot with a single instruction: come to Camp David, tell no one why. By evening, 15 men had gathered inside the wooded Maryland retreat, sworn to secrecy and cut off from the outside world. This was not a vacation. It was an emergency council, convened to decide the fate of the American dollar. President Richard Nixon presided. Beside him sat Treasury Secretary John Connally, a towering Texan who spoke bluntly and moved fast. Nearby was Paul Volcker, the Treasury Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, a man who understood the machinery of international finance better than almost anyone alive. Arthur Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve, argued and worried. Speechwriter William Safire took notes that would later reveal the drama inside those walls. The crisis was simple to state and terrifying to solve. Foreign governments held billions of dollars, and under a 27-year-old agreement, they had the right to trade those dollars for American gold at a fixed price. But the gold was running out. Britain had just requested $3 billion worth of bullion. France had been quietly shipping gold home across the Atlantic for years. The United States no longer possessed enough metal to honor its promises, and the world was beginning to notice. Connally wanted decisive action. He proposed severing the dollar from gold entirely, freezing wages and prices, and slapping a tariff on imports to force other nations to the bargaining table. Burns feared the reaction of markets and allies. Volcker, torn, understood that the arithmetic left almost no choice. For 3 days they debated inside the lodge, drafting and redrafting, aware that whatever they decided would reshape the global economy. Nixon wanted the announcement made before Monday morning, before markets in Tokyo and London could open in panic. The men worked against the clock, weighing a decision that would break a system built by the victors of the Second World War. To understand the weight of what they were about to do, you have to understand the promise itself. A promise made in 1944 in a New Hampshire hotel, and the golden anchor it placed at the center of the world. The promise was born in July 1944 in the resort town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. As the Second World War drew toward its end, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel to design a financial order that would prevent the chaos of the 1930s from ever returning. They wanted stability, predictable exchange rates, and a currency the world could trust. The system they built placed the United States at its center. Every major currency would be fixed to the American dollar, and the dollar, in turn, would be fixed to gold at a precise rate, $35 for 1 ounce. This was the anchor. A French franc, a British pound, a German mark, all derived their value from the dollar, and the dollar's value rested on a solemn commitment. Any foreign government could bring its dollars to the United States and exchange them for gold at that fixed price. This was the gold window, and it was the beating heart of the entire arrangement. It worked because it was believable. In 1945, the United States held roughly 20,000 tons of gold, more than half the world's monetary reserves, stacked in vaults at Fort Knox and beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. American industry was undamaged by war and dominant across the globe. The dollar was, quite literally, as good as gold. Nations rebuilt their economies holding dollars, confident that those paper claims could always be converted into metal. This confidence let world trade flourish. Businesses could sign contracts across borders, knowing exchange rates would hold. The dollar became the currency of oil, of shipping, of international lending. The world ran on a promise written in New Hampshire and secured by American bullion. But a promise is only as strong as the ability to keep it. The system assumed the United States would always hold enough gold to back the dollars it issued. As the decades passed and dollars flooded outward across the globe, faster than gold could ever be mined, that assumption began to crack. The vaults were emptying, and by the late 1960s, the arithmetic had turned quietly, relentlessly, against America. It began as a trickle and became a hemorrhage. In 1945, American gold reserves stood above 20,000 tons. By 1971, they had fallen to roughly 8,100. More than half the nation's gold had flowed out through the window, ounce by ounce, ship by ship. The reason lay in a widening gap. To rebuild the post-war world and fund its ambitions, the United States sent dollars abroad in enormous quantities. Marshall Plan aid rebuilt Europe. American troops and bases spread across the globe. The war in Vietnam devoured billions. And Great Society programs at home added to the spending. Every dollar sent overseas was, in theory, a claim on American gold. By the late 1960s, the foreign dollars held abroad vastly exceeded the gold in American vaults several times over. The promise had become impossible to keep. Everyone knew it. The only question was who would demand payment first. France knew. President Charles de Gaulle, resentful of American dominance, ordered his central bank to convert dollars into gold systematically, sending French warships across the Atlantic to carry the bullion home. Between 1965 and 1967, France drained enormous quantities of American gold and made no secret of the strategy. Others watched and followed. Economists called it the Triffin Dilemma, named for Robert Triffin, who had warned Congress as early as 1960 that the system contained a fatal contradiction. To supply the world with dollars, America had to run deficits. But those very deficits eroded confidence in the dollar's link to gold. The system was destined to break under its own weight. By August 1971, the run was accelerating. Speculators bet against the dollar. Central banks lined up to demand metal while it lasted. That week, Britain's request for $3 billion in gold landed like a final alarm. Had the window stayed open, the vaults would have emptied within months, leaving America with worthless paper obligations and no bullion at all. Default was no longer a risk. It was arithmetic. Nixon and his advisors, sealed inside Camp David, understood they were not choosing whether to break the promise, but how, and how to explain it to a nation about to sit down for Sunday television. Sunday, August 15, 1971. At 9 o'clock in the evening, millions of Americans were watching Bonanza, the popular Western that had dominated Sunday nights for over a decade. The broadcast stopped. The face of the President of the United States filled the screen. Nixon spoke calmly, framing his announcement as a defense of the dollar and American prosperity. But buried in the measured language was a decision that would reshape the world. He announced he had directed the Treasury Secretary to suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The window was closed. The promise made at Bretton Woods, kept for 27 years, ended in a single sentence delivered to a Sunday television audience. Nixon called it a temporary measure. It was permanent. To soften the shock and blunt the inflation he feared would follow, the president announced two more extraordinary steps. First, a 90-day freeze on wages and prices across the entire American economy. The first peacetime wage price controls in the nation's history. Businesses could not raise prices. Workers could not win raises. The government would freeze the cost of living by decree. Second, a 10% surcharge on imported goods. This tariff was a weapon aimed at America's trading partners, especially Japan and West Germany, whose currencies Nixon believed were undervalued. The message was blunt: renegotiate the terms of global trade, or pay the price at the American border. Nixon framed it all as strength. He spoke of protecting the dollar from international speculators, of creating new jobs, of a new prosperity. He did not use the word default. He did not explain that the United States could no longer honor its central financial commitment. The presentation was masterful politics. The reality was a unilateral rewriting of the rules that governed money for the entire non-communist world. The reaction, at first, was applause. American markets rose the next day. The public liked the tough talk and the promise of stability. But beyond America's shores, in the finance ministries and central banks of allied nations, alarm spread. The anchor was gone. Currencies that had been fixed at $1 for a generation suddenly floated free, and no one knew where they would settle. The morning after Nixon's broadcast, the world's finance ministers faced a system without a foundation. Every major currency had been tied to the dollar, and the dollar had been tied to gold. Now the gold link was severed. What held any currency in place? The answer, increasingly, was nothing but markets and trust. At first, the nations tried to save the old order. In December 1971, they met at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and struck an agreement Nixon grandly called the greatest monetary agreement in the history of the world. The dollar was devalued. The price of gold was nominally raised to $38 an ounce. Exchange rates were reset and given wider bands to fluctuate within. It was an attempt to rebuild the fixed system with new numbers. It lasted barely 14 months. The pressures that had broken Bretton Woods had not disappeared. Speculators kept betting against overvalued currencies. Dollars kept flooding across borders. In early 1973, the fixed rates collapsed again, and this time there was no rescue. One by one, the major economies gave up. The pound, the mark, the yen, the franc, all began to float, their values set moment by moment on foreign exchange markets by the forces of supply and demand. This was a profound transformation. For centuries, money had been anchored to something tangible, a weight of gold or silver you could hold and count. Now money floated free, its value determined not by metal in a vault, but by the collective judgment of traders, governments, and markets about the strength of each nation's economy. A currency was worth what people believed it was worth, and belief could shift by the hour. Exchange rates that had held steady for a generation now moved daily. Businesses had to hedge against currency swings. A new industry of foreign exchange trading exploded into being, moving vast sums as the value of money itself became a thing to be bought and sold. The anchor was truly gone, and the ship was sailing on open water. But cutting money loose from gold had unleashed a force the architects had feared most. Without the discipline of metal, prices themselves began to climb, and a decade of relentless inflation was about to begin. The gold window closed on a Sunday night, but the consequences unfolded across a decade. Without gold to anchor its value, the dollar was set loose, and prices began a climb that would define the 1970s. In 1971, U.S. inflation ran near 4.4%. Nixon's wage and price freeze brought a temporary illusion of calm, but when the controls came off, the pressure exploded. By 1974, inflation surged past 12%. The word on every economist's lips was new and ugly: stagflation. Prices rising, growth stalling, unemployment climbing. All at once, a combination the textbooks said could not happen. The 1973 oil embargo poured fuel on the fire. Crude prices quadrupled, from roughly $3 a barrel to nearly $12, and the cost rippled into gasoline lines, grocery bills, and factory floors. Families who had saved carefully watched their money buy less each month. A dollar tucked away in 1971 lost nearly half its purchasing power by the end of the decade. Fixed pensions shrank in real terms. Passbook savings accounts, once a symbol of prudence, bled value silently. The middle class learned a bitter lesson. Cash sitting still was cash melting away. Interest rates chased inflation upward. By 1980, prices peaked near 14%, and mortgage rates climbed toward 18%, freezing the housing market. To break the fever, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker pushed the federal funds rate above 19% in 1981, deliberately triggering a recession to strangle inflation out of the system. Unemployment rose above 10%. Factories fell quiet. The cure was brutal, and it worked, but only after millions felt the pain. The connection ran straight back to that August weekend. A currency once disciplined by metal now floated on confidence alone, and confidence proved volatile. Governments could print, spend, and borrow with fewer immediate constraints, and the bill arrived as inflation. An entire generation reshaped its financial instincts around one fear: money that would not hold its worth. Yet, even as the dollar wobbled at home, a quiet arrangement was taking shape thousands of miles away, in the oil fields of the Middle East. one that would give the unbacked dollar a powerful new reason to be wanted. If gold no longer backed the dollar, what would keep the world wanting it? The answer came not from a mint, but from a desert. In 1974, as inflation raged and confidence in American money faltered, Washington struck a series of quiet arrangements with Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter on earth. The terms were elegant in their simplicity. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States offered military protection, weapons, and technical support to the Saudi kingdom. Treasury Secretary William Simon traveled to Riyadh to seal the understanding, and the Saudis agreed to recycle their surplus dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds. By 1975, the rest of OPEC followed, and the entire global oil trade settled in dollars. The effect was profound. Every nation that needed oil, and every nation did, now needed dollars to buy it. Japan, Germany, Brazil, and dozens more had to hold dollar reserves whether they trusted American policy or not. The dollar had lost its metal anchor, but gained something arguably stronger, a permanent structural demand tied to the one commodity the modern world could not live without. This was the birth of the petrodollar. Oil producers earned mountains of dollars, then parked them in American banks and government debt, financing U.S. deficits in the process. The money flowed out for crude and flowed back as loans. It was a closed loop that kept the dollar circulating as the planet's reserve currency, the default unit for trade, contracts, and central bank vaults. Roughly 60% of global reserves would remain dollar-denominated for decades. Gold had disciplined the dollar with scarcity. Oil sustained it with necessity. The genius and the risk was that the whole arrangement rested on trust and geopolitics, rather than bullion in a vault. The dollar was now money because the world had agreed to treat it as money, and because it could buy the fuel that ran everything. With this new anchor secured, the United States held a privilege no nation had ever wielded so freely: the ability to borrow in its own currency, on a scale the world had never seen. Free from the discipline of gold, the United States discovered a new and intoxicating power: the ability to borrow almost without limit. Under Bretton Woods, gold reserves had acted as a brake. Every dollar carried an implied claim on metal, and the government could only stretch so far before foreign creditors demanded bullion. After August 1971, that brake was gone. Money became a matter of policy, not physics. The numbers tell the story. In 1971, total U.S. federal debt stood at roughly $400 billion. By 1981, it crossed $1 trillion. By 1990, it topped $3 trillion. The 2008 financial crisis pushed it past $10 trillion as the government rescued banks and stimulated a collapsing economy. The pandemic of 2020 accelerated everything, and by the 2020s, the figure soared beyond $30 trillion, a scale unimaginable to the men who gathered at Camp David. This was the promise and peril of fiat money. A currency backed only by government word could be created to fund wars, tax cuts, safety nets, and bailouts alike. The Treasury issued bonds, the Federal Reserve stood ready to buy them, and the dollar's global demand, anchored by oil and trust, meant buyers always appeared. Other nations followed the same path. Japan's debt would climb past 250% of its economy. Fiat systems everywhere allowed spending to outrun revenue year after year. Deficits became permanent, not emergency measures but routine budgeting. Interest payments alone grew into one of the largest line items in the federal budget, hundreds of billions of dollars flowing simply to service what was already owed. Critics warned of a reckoning. Defenders argued that a sovereign borrowing in its own currency could never truly run out of money. Both were describing the same untethered world. What made it all possible was the quiet revolution of 1971. When the dollar stopped being a receipt for gold and became a self-standing instrument of national will, the ceiling on borrowing lifted. Debt became the engine of modern government finance. And that engine still runs today, powering a financial system whose foundations were poured on a single summer weekend. Look in your wallet. Check your bank balance. Every dollar, every euro, every yen, every pound you hold is fiat currency. Money that exists because a government declares it so, and because millions of people agree to accept it. None of it can be exchanged for gold at a fixed price. None of it rests on metal in a vault. This is the world that began on August 15, 1971. When Nixon closed the gold window that Sunday night, interrupting Bonanza to speak to 60 million Americans, he was not merely solving a currency crisis. He was severing the final thread connecting money to a physical thing. Within 2 years, fixed exchange rates collapsed, and currencies floated freely. Within a decade, inflation reshaped a generation's savings. Oil gave the dollar a new anchor, and debt grew to scales measured in tens of trillions. All of it flowed from that weekend at Camp David, from 15 men in a mountain retreat deciding the future of the world's money. The system they created is the one we still inhabit. Central banks manage currencies by adjusting interest rates and creating money on computer screens. Value floats on markets, sentiment, and confidence. When trust holds, the system works with astonishing flexibility, funding growth and cushioning crises. When trust wavers, inflation and instability return, reminding us that nothing tangible stands beneath the numbers. It is a system built entirely on belief. Every transaction, every paycheck, every loan is an act of faith. Faith that the dollar tomorrow will still buy what it buys today. Faith that the promise printed on paper and stored in databases will be honored. There is no gold to redeem, no metal to demand. There is only the collective agreement of billions of people and the credibility of the institutions that stand behind it. That is the true legacy of August 15, 1971. Not a single policy, but a transformation in the very nature of what money is. The men at Camp David did not just close a window, they changed the definition of value itself. On that summer weekend, quietly and permanently, money became a promise, not a metal.